What's going on, y'all? Thanks for checking in with Callie. Please like, subscribe if you haven't. So now more comments are coming out about Doc Rivers, and it's really starting to become even more irritating than before. And you heard me speak on this in regards to his comments the other day. You can check out the video. But now things are resurfacing in regards to Doc Rivers saying that he warned Kawhi basically about Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, SGA, in regards to Paul George. So what I mean by that is in 2019, when Kawhi came to the Clippers, it was to be known that Kawhi wanted Paul George on the team with him, and he would only commit to the Clippers if they went out and got somebody like or Paul George. And Doc Rivers is saying now that he actually, confronted Kawhi and asked him, "Are you sure you want to make this move?" Because SGA is going to be a heck of a player in a couple years, about a year or two, and you would have a very good sidekick. Now, I will say this much. I don't know how much, credit Doc Rivers thinks he's trying to get or excuses he's trying to plant, all these things. You hear, things with JJ Redick, pushing back on Doc Rivers and a lot of things like that, and which we'll talk about that more in another video. But, this situation here specifically, I am kind of like, why is Doc Rivers coming out saying all these things? I mean, why is he planting all these seeds in different places and saying everything he done for these organizations and what, predictions he made and all these type of things? Is he trying to take credit for something because the Milwaukee Bucks aren't playing up to potential, or the potential people think they should be? I mean, I really don't understand. I'm really actually kind of lost in regards to everything that I'm hearing about in regards to this, because it's kind of frustrating all at the same time, because it's like, why is Doc Rivers doing all this talking and not winning? Because when he was a coach for all these teams, he wasn't winning. He won a championship with one Boston Celtics team that was, I'm talking, fully loaded from top to bottom. I mean, there's really no way you could have lost with that team, honestly. I mean, it was just, and plus they was in the Eastern Conference where, always back then, the Western Conference was always harder. Seemed like it had it had better teams in the Western Conference back then than it did in the East. In the East, it really only literally had like a few good teams, in my opinion. But either way, my point is, now there's things coming out. You could read the Bleacher Report in regards to things coming out about, him saying about SGA. I will say this, though, looking at last night's game with the Thunder and the Clippers, I'll say this much, Kawhi sure could have used SGA last night. Honestly, if you ask me, if we're looking at it right now, of course, the trade for Paul George was bad, because as good as SGA is, I would say, the way SGA is playing this year, honestly, he's probably top 2 in the MVP conversation. He really is. So if we're looking at it right now, I would say, yeah, it possibly could have been a bad trade. You know what I'm saying? But I guess at that time, thinking of who Paul George, was and how good he can score and all those type things, you look at him as the type of player where you could win with a player like him if you got a better player on the team, a number one player who can take over games when Paul George doesn't. So, I guess the notion was, as long as Kawhi was there, he would take over when, Paul George is not playing up to par, and when he's basically, being playoff P, way off P in the playoff, which he's done many, many times before. And, the Clippers still could win. Only thing to backfire on the Clippers really was their health and the bubble, because, a lot of people say the bubble was just like a downslide for the Clippers, and it was. Not going to sit there and lie, but based upon the players who didn't want to be there, who didn't show up, some left, came back. It was tough for the Clippers. It really was. So that was one of those situations where it was just a discombobulated type of locker room, especially with everybody looking at the Kawhi Leonard situation, the load management and all that stuff, and the media putting things out there. It was just, the media just had a field day on the load management thing. So honestly, Stephen A. and all them really should thank Kawhi Leonard, because he basically gave them headlines and storylines they wouldn't have had if load management wasn't a big part of the NBA at that time. So really, that kudos to Kawhi. If he definitely kept a lot of people a job, if you ask me. But either way, I'll say this much. I really hope that Doc Rivers quote does not, I'll say play out well. And what I mean by that is age well, because if Paul George goes in these playoffs, hypothetically, and don't show up, it's going to make Doc Rivers look more right. And it's going to make a lot more people, including Clippers fans, look at it like, damn, yeah, we should have kept SGA, because if looking at it right now, if the Clippers would have waited a year or two, SGA would be not only a good number 2, it would be like a good 1A, 1B. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, in the way SGA is playing right now, yeah, I would take him over Paul George right now if the trade was actually on the table. Absolutely. Because he's younger. He's more, to me, he's more consistent. And that's the thing I always have against Paul George. You look at last night's game against OKC. I mean, he's like 5 for 16. I think he had like 14 points. Paul George is just one of those players where I respect the fact. I always said he's a good player. I always said he's a streaky type player, though. I mean, he has moments where he'll look like the MVP of the season or one of the best players in the league. But then he'll have moments where he looks like, he's a top 25 player in the league instead of like a top 10 player in the league. That's just the way Paul George is. And when you have streaky shooters like that, or guys who streaky like that, you got to just hope that you catch their streak at the right time, which is the playoffs. And that's always been Paul George's Achilles heel throughout his career, maybe besides a few seasons here and there. So, I mean, hopefully Kawhi and the Clippers made the right decision with Paul George. I still question Paul George in the playoffs, in regards to showing up in big games, because a lot of people will sit there and push back on me when I've made comments about Paul George and things like that. And I make comments about all players, whoever I talk about. If it needs to be said, I'm going to say it. I've even criticized Kawhi at times, even back when the load management thing was there, and certain situations, even though I never thought he, faked the injury, but sometimes you got to try to play through some injuries and try to go out there and do your best. And I know there are times where that didn't happen, because you got to understand, he grew up under Greg Popovich, and Greg Popovich showed him the way to win championships and when to go all out, and that's what Kawhi knows, and that's how he is, and that's how he was raised in the NBA. So you really can't fault him for that. But it's like, I just want to see Kawhi on the court more, so that's why I had some criticism toward him at that time. But it's nothing really that serious. But when it comes time to show up in the playoffs, I don't question Kawhi Leonard. I don't question anything about Kawhi Leonard's ability, and I never ever will, because I know what the man could do, and that's the reason why he's my favorite player. But at the same time, when I look at somebody like Paul George, and when I've criticized Paul George, some fans have pushed back on me by saying, oh, you're being too critical on Paul George, this, and that. And some fans would say Paul George is a better player than Kawhi Leonard. That's your opinion. You have a right to your opinion if you believe that. But I mean, honestly, he's not better than Kawhi Leonard. And the consistency part tells you that times 10. And that's the reason why I say Paul George is really good, but when you need him most, is he really going to show up? And like a lot of people said when Kawhi went down a few years ago, when Paul George got him to the Western Conference Finals, it wasn't Paul George who got him to the Western Conference Finals. It was Kawhi more so, because they wouldn't have got past Dallas if Kawhi didn't turn into God mode for them to beat Luka Doncic. And then Terrence Mann had a 39 career high point game against Utah in Game 6 to seal the deal, so they wouldn't have to go to a Game 7. And that actually propelled them to the next round in the conference finals against the Phoenix Suns. But Paul George missed those 2 free throws in crunch time in the fourth quarter against the Suns that could have pushed it to another game. And then, maybe the Clippers, you never know what might have happened. See, if that's Kawhi Leonard or if that's some other superstar, they're not missing 2 free throws. Even if that's LeBron James. LeBron James is not a great free throw shooter, but more likely he probably would have hit one of those. Maybe more likely not miss both. And that's the difference to me with Paul George. He is a great player. He has a lot of great tendencies. But the reason why he isn't the elite of the elite is because he doesn't really do this, on a consistent basis where you need it. And when you look at last night's game against OKC, well, I mean, Kawhi was shooting well and playing good. And the reason why I think the Clippers didn't win that game was because Paul George didn't show up. And he has a lot of moments like that in games that they really need to try to make a push, because you look at the standings right now, they didn't need to lose to OKC last night. They needed to beat OKC Because, like I said, they're trying to get that number one seed, no matter what nobody says. They're trying to be the best seeded team they can be and get the best first round matchup they can get. So if you're the number one seed, you face somebody in the 6th seed or 8th seed or whatever the case may be. That's a better matchup for you rather than facing somebody like Dallas, where you might have to go 6-7 games, or facing the Phoenix Suns, or you might have to go 6-7 games or something like that. You wanna put yourself in the best position as possible and be, home mostly, and have the home court advantage if possible. So, I mean, losing games like that are detrimental. And that's what I said in the other day video. They have to come out, with that, with that switch back on. We have to come out here and put our foot down and play our best basketball down the stretch. And that's what the Clippers need to do. Now, I think they'll rebound from this loss and everything like that. But that's one of those games where I just thought that, Paul George would show up and play a little bit better. And you look at SGA, I mean, he's out there he looks kind of like a younger Kawhi Leonard, the way he does the turnaround fade away. He's smooth with it. He gets to his spots. He's not fast. He's not the most athletic. He's just like a young Kawhi Leonard, kind of, sort of, what I'm saying? But he's very effective and he's very consistent. And this is why I said consistency wins championships. When you're inconsistent, you don't know what player is going to show up at times. And that's not something that's going to bode well for the Clippers. And if Paul George does the same thing he did in the bubble, well, you know something? The Clippers might actually go home, because it's like Kawhi can't do everything by himself. He got Paul George to come to LA with him to take some load off of him. I mean, if that's the case, well, Kawhi should have just stayed in Toronto and kept Norman Powell there and a bunch of role players and keep doing it all by himself. If that's what Kawhi was partitioning for, he went and got Paul George to be that number 2 guy. So when you play big games and go against opponents where you really need to show up and you really need to show out, that's what you do. That's what you're there for. And even you look at somebody like Anthony Davis, a lot of us criticize him as being number 2 to LeBron, but damn, Anthony Davis did show up in the bubble. He did show up in a playoffs where they needed him most, and he played his very best basketball in the playoffs of the bubble, and it helped them win a championship. You see what I'm talking about? Your number 2 or your 1A or your 1B guy. You can have a 1A, 1B guy, but that 1B guy has to be consistent at some point. He can't just be streaky all the time. That's not going to win you championships. At some point, when you're healthy, we need consistency. And it needs to, I would rather Paul George average 19 or 20 points consistently every single night, or 22 points. I'll say 22 points. 22 points every single night and don't miss a beat, because that's a player that you can depend on when playoff time starts. Not, Paul George might go 5 for 19 or something like that, 2 or 3 games, like 2 games out of a 7-game series. Well, that can get the Clippers beat, and that's not what they need. And that's always been my problem with Paul George. I'm not saying that Doc Rivers is overly right about what he says, but he could be, based upon these playoffs, because we got to see Paul George, really, he don't have to go out there and be, finals MVP or something like that. You just got to go out there and be consistent. Be consistent in what you're doing and give the Clippers that every single night, because Kawhi is going to be Kawhi, and be consistent as he is. And what you get out of James Harden and Russell Westbrook is additional to what the main 2 players are going to give consistently. That's all that needs to happen. If they can do that, along with staying healthy, then they'll be fine. So, I mean, hopefully, I hope that, these comments by Doc Rivers don't really go too far. I hope Paul George actually kills these comments by going out there, playing his best and being more consistent and not making it look like Doc Rivers is right any more than what he think that he is. Because I guarantee if Paul George goes out there in the playoffs and plays games like he did last night against the Thunder, in which the Clippers lost, it's going to make it seem like Doc Rivers is more right. And that's just something that I know the Clippers might not actually care about, but the media is they might actually take that and run with it and go way far with it. And they use that against the Clippers in regards to, the Clippers lost in the playoffs. They were supposed to be this juggernaut team, or come up with some story or something like that about the Clippers and utilize that against them and make the Clippers look bad. So I really hope that does not happen. I hope these comments by, Doc Rivers, they've resurfaced now, but hopefully they don't age well, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But only way it doesn't happen is if Paul George, shows up and plays the way he's supposed to, or at least be consistent enough, to help the Clippers get over the top, along with Kawhi Leonard playing at his best.